My friends have always been a rather unusual group. We met at school, and although our life paths diverged, we have remained friends. They all chose professions that are considered truly masculine. Some became loggers, some went to work on oil rigs, and some are engaged in construction. Their lives are filled with physical labor, dangerous situations, and incredible stories that they are always happy to tell. I took a completely different path and became an IT specialist. This decision often became an occasion for jokes. Friends call my work computer nonsense or joke that I play with mice and keyboards. They tease me for not having calluses on my hands, and I in turn tease them, imagining myself a caveman. Here are your computers, and I will dig rocks and hunt mammoths. But despite all the jokes, there was always respect between us. They know that my work is important too, even though it looks completely different. And I, for my part, admire their resilience and courage, because the situations they have to face can be truly terrifying. Our meetings are a rare occurrence. Since my friends work in different parts of the country, we hardly see each other. Therefore, every evening when we are all together becomes a real event. This time we gathered at a small local bar, which served the best beer in town. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed. Old wooden tables, a slightly neglected look, and the sounds of country music in the background. We sat at a round table, each with a mug of beer, and exchanged stories. As always, the topic of conversation was work and the dangerous situations associated with it. One of my friends, who works on an oil rig, told me about an explosion that happened on his shift. 3 people died, and it left a deep mark on his memory. Another, a logger named Danny, shared a terrifying story about how a colleague next to him lost an arm to a broken rope. I listened to their stories with intense interest. Each of them had its share of risk and drama. It was scary to even imagine what they had been through. But at the same time, I felt a certain guilt. My life seemed so simple and calm compared to theirs. Listening to my friends' scary stories made me feel a little uncomfortable. On the one hand, I had also had an incident that made me face unspeakable fear. But on the other hand, I wasn't sure if it was worth sharing in such company. Their stories were about real danger, explosions, injuries, and life-threatening situations. Mine was a completely different story, more like something out of a horror movie. However, my friends had already paid attention to me. Everyone was waiting for me to say something. "Come on, it's your turn," Danny encouraged me. I sighed and decided to tell it anyway. But before that, I warned them, "Guys, my story is not about explosions or injuries, but it really scared me. I hope you won't laugh." After that, I began to tell. My words sounded cautious because I was reliving those terrible moments when they happened to me. Every time, remembering the details, goosebumps ran down my skin. My friends listened attentively, no one interrupted, and this gave me the strength to continue. My story began on a quiet autumn evening when I had to go to the mountains. It seemed like everything was as usual. I was driving an old pickup truck, trying to find my way through the winding paths. The rain had been drizzling for several hours, creating the perfect atmosphere for reflection and a little melancholy. I decided to take a shortcut through a remote forest road that wound through dark trees. The dusk quickly turned into thick darkness, and the forest around seemed endless. The trees, like ghosts, stretched to the sky with their twisted branches. I began to feel a strange anxiety, although I could not understand the reasons for it. My fingers tightly gripped the steering wheel, and my heart beat a little faster than usual. All sounds outside the window suddenly fell silent. The forest, which is always filled with the rustling of leaves, the cries of birds, or the rustling of animals, became oppressively silent. I noticed the pickup truck's headlights illuminating something strange on the road, like a shadow that flashed by at incredible speed. I braked hard, the wheels screeching on the wet ground. What was that? Flashed through my mind. I looked around, peering into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I still felt a cold sweat slowly trickling down my back. I continued to drive forward, although the tension only grew. The road became narrower and narrower, and the headlights barely pierced the thick fog that was beginning to rise from the ground. From time to time, I glanced in the rearview mirror, although I could not explain to myself why. It seemed that someone or something was watching me. My thoughts were interrupted by a loud impact. The car shuddered, and I almost lost control. Having stopped, I got out, holding a flashlight in my hands. The light barely pierced the darkness, and this only increased the anxiety. In front of the car, on the ground, there was an animal that looked like a deer. But something was wrong. I moved closer to get a better look at it, and at the same moment I felt an eerie silence around me. The deer looked unnatural. Its skin was pale, and its eyes empty, without the usual sparkle of life, as if someone had drained all its energy from it, leaving only a shell. "This is wrong," I muttered. Suddenly, I felt something move behind me. I turned so sharply that I almost dropped the flashlight. A figure appeared in the darkness, but before I could react, it was gone. I quickly returned to the car, trying to calm myself. These are just fears caused by the darkness and fatigue, I convinced myself. But as soon as I started the engine, I realized something worse had happened. The car was unresponsive. It simply refused to start, even though it had been running perfectly just a minute ago. The rain began to fall harder, dripping down the window in heavy drops. I realized that staying in the car was not the best option. I decided to try to find help, even though I wasn't sure where I even was. Turning on my flashlight, I took a few steps into the darkness. The forest, which had always seemed cozy and peaceful, had now turned into a real trap. Branches grabbed my clothes like bony fingers, and the sound of the rain mixed with my heavy footsteps. And then I heard a sound. It was a soft whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded from all sides, as if the forest itself had started talking. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized that I had to get back to the car immediately. But when I turned around, I saw something that made my heart stop. A tall shadow stood next to the car, motionless and faceless. I stood there, unable to look away from the shadow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and seemed to absorb even the faint light from my flashlight. Its outlines were blurred, but something about it gave off an indescribable menace. I felt a cold breeze rush through me, making my heart clench with fear. "What is it?" I whispered, as if hoping the forest would answer. Suddenly the shadow began to move, but not with its feet. It slid across the ground like smoke or fog approaching the car. I could feel the ground beneath my feet slipping, the air thickening like syrup. Although logic told me to get back in the pickup truck, my body wouldn't listen. "Move," I whispered to myself, but it seemed to freeze in place. At that moment, something clicked in my head, and I rushed to the car, as if my survival instinct had taken over. In a moment, I was inside and had slammed the door, but before I could do so, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow freeze. It stood in the distance, as if waiting or studying me. Sitting in the car, I tried to calm myself, but my heart was beating so loudly that it felt like it was about to burst my chest. I looked out the window, but the shadow had disappeared. It was no longer there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, that it was hiding somewhere nearby, invisible to my eye. The forest grew darker, and the rain pounded against the windows with increasing force. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here for long. The car was my only fortress, but even that no longer felt safe. I sat in the cab, clutching the flashlight in my hands, and tried to concentrate. But after a few minutes, it became oppressively quiet inside. It seemed that even the rain outside the window had stopped. And suddenly I heard it again, a whisper. Quiet, barely audible, but at the same time so loud that it echoed in my head. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but this sound was completely different. It was not chaotic, but as if it consisted of individual words that I could not make out. I turned my head, trying to find the source of this whisper. It seemed to come from the depths of the forest, but at the same time it enveloped the car from all sides. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "It's just my imagination," I told myself, but my voice trembled. The whisper gradually intensified. It sounded unusual, as if several voices were overlapping each other. They grew louder and louder, creating an ominous hum. I tried to turn on the radio to drown out the sound, but it only hissed. Suddenly, the sound changed. The whisper turned into a clear word that I heard right next to my ear. Get out. My heart froze, and my breath stopped. I turned my head, but there was no one around. My hands were shaking, but I still tried to start the car. The engine revved, but it never started. I heard the word again, louder this time. Get out. This time I could no longer ignore the voice. Something was compelling me to open the door, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, my hands slowly reached for the handle. Only when the door had barely opened did I hear a new sound, the loud snap of a branch behind the car. A crack behind the car made me freeze. My heart froze, and something cold seemed to squeeze my chest. I slowly looked around, although part of me begged me not to. Through the fogged-up glass, I could see almost nothing. Only the darkness that swallowed every detail of the forest and the faint glow of the flashlight I had left on the dashboard. Another crack, this time closer, as if someone or something was creeping up on the car. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers turned white, my skin creaking with the tension. Was it a predator? Or was it the same creepy silhouette? My head was filling with the worst-case scenarios, and I could barely contain my panic. I tried to turn on the headlights, but pressing the button did nothing. No light appeared. Only a brief click broke the silence. A feeling of helplessness gripped me from head to toe, and suddenly I heard the sound of breathing. Heavy, uneven, as if dissolving in the air. It came from behind. My skin crawled. I slowly turned my head, hoping to see something, but instead I heard something scratching the back of the car. My breathing became shallow, almost rapid. I couldn't afford to scream or make any sudden movements. Only silence could save me. Suddenly, the rear window cracked slightly, as if someone from the outside had gently pressed a hand on it. I gathered my strength and grabbed my flashlight. Turning around, I directed the beam of light into the back seat. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then I noticed something strange. Barely noticeable scratches that appeared right in front of my eyes, as if an invisible claw was drawing them on the glass. My nerves failed me, and I dropped the flashlight, which rolled under the seat. And then everything went quiet. The breathing disappeared. There were no more crackling sounds, but this silence was even more terrifying than any sounds. Silence enveloped everything around. Even the rain stopped, leaving the car in absolute stillness. I sat, unable to move, listening for every sound that could break this ominous silence again. But nothing happened. Only my own breathing, heavy and ragged, broke the darkness that enveloped me. I bent down, trying to reach the flashlight lying under the seat. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my fingers barely obeyed, trembling with fear. I had almost grabbed it when I heard the whisper again, but this time it was deeper, as if directly from under the ground. Stay, the voice whispered, so close that I jumped. I threw myself back into the seat, pressing myself against its back, and lifted my head, trying to see who or what was talking. But there was nothing to see. I stared into the rearview mirror, and my breath froze. There, in the darkness, something seemed to be moving. A shadow. It began to grow from the depths of the forest, growing larger and larger, but still blurry, like a ball of black smoke. It had no shape, but at the same time it resembled something humanoid. I could feel its gaze, if it could even be called a gaze, penetrating me. The car suddenly began to sway, as if something had gripped it from the outside. The metal creaked, and the glass in the rear windows cracked under the pressure. I pressed the gas pedal, trying to start the engine, but it didn't respond. My hands were clutching the ignition key, but my efforts were futile. And then I heard it again. A whisper, but now it was laughter. Deep, eerie, and so terrible that it made my blood run cold. It seemed to me that this was the end, that this sinister forest had become my final trap.